let's get into lesson 3, which is what I call multi-level feedback loops and the erosion of civilizations. Wow, big stuff. How does it relate to Russell 2? I'll try to show you. In a previous lesson, I mentioned this resource in our Erosion Resources Index. It's an excerpt of a book, which it's a 25-page overview of erosion, and I extracted it from Building Soils for Better Crops, which you can see in the background here. That's the cover, and there's a chapter on reducing erosion and runoff. And this is good stuff to read. It's easy to read. It's free. It's readily available. You can download it. So I've set this aside as something you can read. One of the things in this excerpt is this diagram, okay? And it talks about a downward spiral of soil degradation, right? And we start with this idea that we have intensive tillage, soil erosion, insufficient added residues. And so we start a process where we have erosion, organic matter decreases, soil aggregates break down, surface becomes more compacted, crust forms. Okay, we make the land actually more vulnerable to erosion as we degrade it, and as more organic matter is lost, crop yields are reduced, and we get into hunger and malnutrition. Wow, how'd you get to that? But this is a feedback loop. It's a negative feedback loop, right? So the worse I take care of the land, the worse the land performs, the harder it is to take care of it well, it just keeps going down. And you can have these with human health too, right? When you get run down, you're more vulnerable to more diseases, which would then perhaps lead you to miss work, which would lead you to what? Not have the money you need to buy the resources you need. It goes downhill from there, right? So I was inspired by this and by a lot of other reading to kind of come up with sort of my own model. I call it a negative feedback loop of land use intensification and soil degradation. Wow, that's a mouthful. What I want to highlight here this is all about why we have the jobs we have. It's why our agencies were created and why Russell 2 was created, Russell before it and the USLE before it. It's about this. So let's talk a little bit about a negative feedback loop at the individual farm level, individual field level. So just picture one field, right? One field. And let's say for whatever reason, we're going to use that land more intensively. Farmer, needs more production, right? For whatever reason. It could be selfish. It could be a very understandable reason. I need to get more out of this land. I'm going to use it more intensely. I'm going to push it. I'm going to do more tillage. Kind of take more, right? Take more biomass off. I'm going to feed. I'm going to graze it all to the ground. Whatever. That's going to result in some more soil erosion and degradation, and that's going to impair function again over time, right? And that loss of function that resulted from that first step in degradation is going to make the soil even more vulnerable to erosion and degradation, and will have even less function, and that will lead to even more erosion degradation, right? And ultimately, at some point, it may not be right away, guys, and that's something it's very important not to tell your farmer, oh, you're going to lose productivity next year because you're losing 10 tons per acre per year. That's not true. As far as yield potential, maybe there'll be some gullies out there. That's a problem, to farm around, but productivity losses will occur potentially over a longer period, but eventually they will occur, okay? And the idea here is, well, so they occur, well, but remember, we want more productivity. So what we might often see, right, is the soil's less productive, land's not giving me as much, I got to push it harder, right? I'm going to have to take even more, right, to make the same, to make my rent. And so you can imagine this loop kind of repeating itself over time, right? So what happens over a long period of time? Whatever period of time that is, long period of time. Long-term outcome, these are some of the outcomes, right? We get poverty of the land, right? We're talking about one field. The field's worn out, we abandon the field or convert it to other use, right? And guys, this is what happened across much of Virginia, especially the Piedmont, worn out, right? Converted to trees, some cases converted to state parks. That's a negative feedback loop at the individual field level. What if we look at a whole farm, right? So the individual farm level, just one farm, same idea, more intensive land use. We get into that loop, right? Where we push the land harder, we take more, soil function degrades, we get less productivity, we keep pushing, keep pushing. What happens over time? Could be 10 years, could be a generation, could be even longer. But if we keep pushing, okay, we get this. We get poverty of the family, right? The farm is worn out. He can't sustain us. We convert to another job, abandon the farm, move away, right? So same kind of pattern. What if this happens at the national or regional level, right? On every farm, especially if we have an agricultural society, or even if we don't, we have people being fed in more intensive land use. The same idea, right? We push harder, and sometimes, guys, think about it. Why would we use the land more intensively over time, right? Over generations, over a century or two, right? The society is successful, right? We have more and more people. We have more and more demand for food, right? So we might move to more marginal ground. So we're pushing the land to give us more. And we keep pushing and pushing, and the cycle continues. What are some long-term outcomes as we get into this negative feedback loop and soil degradation continues? All right. We get poverty over time of the people, right? We get famine, conflict, ecological collapse, mass migration, and the society collapses. And you might say to me, Chris, you're going way too far with this, right? And I'm saying, I don't think I am, because it's this concept, right, that if we look at historical patterns, there's a clear historical pattern that this more intensive approach to land use has led this to happen many times over thousands of years, and we can see examples of it in our own history as a nation. And so this guy, David Montgomery, he's a geomorphologist, I think from Washington. I met him and spent a week with him personally here as he toured Virginia, giving some talks. A really neat guy. He wrote this book, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations. And there's a few popular books out there about erosion. This one's from 2007. This one is really, really good, and I strongly recommend it. But, if you don't want to read a whole book, you can watch David give an hour-long summary of it on YouTube. And what I'm going to tell you is that this, he didn't create this diagram. I created this diagram, but this diagram pretty much sums up what he's saying, is that this approach has explained the decline of many great civilizations. So what I thought I would try to do, again, and to try to keep things interactive, is I try to show you a clip of David talking about one example of this kind of phenomenon. So let me give that a try.
Let me talk about colonial North America. Why? Well, there's actually a great wealth of historical documentation from colonial North America, and a great story in terms of the role of soil erosion on shaping contemporary American society. Let's start with a letter from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton in 1796, where he wrote about complaining about the erosive practices that colonial farmers used on their plantations. And in Washington's words, he wrote that a few years more of increased sterility will drive the inhabitants of the Atlantic states westward for support, whereas if they were taught how to improve the old, instead of going in pursuit of new and productive soils, they would make these acres, which now scarcely yield them anything, turn out beneficial to themselves. Washington was basically arguing that the future of the United States in the earliest days of the country lay in westward expansion across the Appalachians, not because of some kind of manifest destiny to overrun and civilize a continent. That argument came a century later as a bit of social reverse engineering. He was making the argument based on the idea that the farmers on the eastern seaboard were exhausting the soils fast enough that as an agricultural nation, we would have to go to the other side of the mountains to stay in business. Washington was a plantation owner. He was very concerned with the role of soil erosion on agricultural lands in the southern United States. Why was colonial agriculture so erosive? Well, in part because tobacco and cotton were very erosive crops to grow in the way that colonial agriculture treated them. There's a whole section on the book that goes into the causes for that and how it actually contributed to the run-up to the American Civil War. But let me simply today focus on how much soil erosion happened as a result of colonial agriculture in the southeastern United States. This map shows you the answer to that. It was put together by Stan Trimble a couple decades ago, and it shows the extent of historical soil erosion, post-colonial soil erosion, in the Piedmont region, or the upland region, ranging from Virginia up there in the upper left-hand corner down to Alabama in the lower right-hand corner. So we're not talking about the coastal plain where it was relatively flat and erosion wasn't as big a problem. We're not talking about the Appalachians where they weren't farming yet. But we're talking about the upland hill country farms throughout the southeast. I need to notice that most of it has lost 4 to 10 inches of soil, that gray color across there. Some of it more than 10 inches of soil. Was that a big deal or a small deal? There was only about a foot of fertile black topsoil across this region to begin with. So if over 200 years of colonial agriculture, we were able to erode off most of the soil across a fairly broad region of a country that was fundamentally dependent on agriculture for its national economic livelihood. Think about what the Greeks and Romans could have done to their homelands with 1,000 years at it. Think of what the Easter Islanders could have done it with 1,000 years at it. Think of what the Chinese did in the edge of the Tibetan Plateau, a several thousand-year run at it. In other words, the idea that sustained soil erosion from agricultural activity could lead to wholesale loss of the soil starts to become not such a crazy idea when we can demonstrate that it happened in my own country in historical times.
Well, I hope that came through okay. Did a little editing of that clip, and I hope that was useful for you guys to see. So there's David Montgomery using one example, right? And he actually got a lot of interest in that book. But here's the truth of the matter: is that those ideas that he shared weren't new. He put them together in a really great way, and I strongly encourage you to read it. But if you go to the NRCS website, they talk about the history of NRCS, and they talk about this document, Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years, right, by this guy, Walter Clay Loudermilk, who ended up being one of the first, I think, assistant administrators of the Soil Conservation Service, or he was assistant chief of the Soil Conservation Service. In the 1930s, he went around and he studied some of these past civilizations. And the document is really, really useful. And I remember one of Bobby Weiscarver, who's kind of a legendary NRCS guy from the Shenandoah Valley, said that when he first started, they would make everybody read this. This has always struck me. This is from the book, again, from written a really long time ago, but it points out that in Tunisia, an area that, according to Loudermilk, is, a history of great soil neglect over a long period of time. You can see the, at least at the time, the ruins of this amphitheater that could seat 60,000 people. And as he said here, only a few thousand people inhabit this area now, right? So in Roman times, again, we must have had a thriving agricultural landscape. And as Loudermilk points out, the small flock of sheep, a fair indication of land's ability to support life. So, this idea that we've seen great civilizations fall over time because of soil mismanagement is, it's not a new idea, and it should be sobering to you. This is a quote from Montgomery's book, that basically over time we were able to just keep finding new lands to farm, and that's kind of how we've kept up, right, this pattern as a human race. But he points out that starting in the 1980s, the total amount of land under cultivation began declining for the first time since Mesopotamian, ag began long time ago. So what does that tell us, right? Remember this idea of intensification. We're going to have to use the land we have more intensively to feed more and more people. What does that tell us about where we're headed? We're going to have to do a better job, managing that land. So David and his wife, Ann B. Clay, they partnered to write this last book, but David's book on dirt is not the most uplifting in terms of optimism about the future. But he wrote this other book, Growing a Revolution, and I want to finish by saying we think we can take this downward spiral here, and I'll do a little trick here. we can turn this into a positive feedback loop. I mean, or can we? Can we? So let me show you. Flip this upside down, right? And you know, we actually follow the ideas in the same book, Building Soils for Better Crops. If you try to build your soils, if you apply these 4 principles that we're promoting with the For the Soil campaign, right? In theory, and we've seen farmers do it, you know, we can reverse the loop and it becomes a positive feedback loop, right? So the concept is, let's follow some of these basic soil health principles: less tillage, more cover, right? Save some time, save some fuel, save some steel. That's an advantage, but we get less erosion too, and we get less loss of water through runoff and evaporation. So what? Our crop may hold a little better under drought stress. This is what farmers have seen with the adoption of continuous no-till across Virginia. Soil structure improves. Hey, I can get back in the field sooner after heavy rain without damaging the soil, right? So the soil is starting to improve, right? I may not be able to measure changes in the soil, but I can see it in the way the soil is behaving. Better surface tilt. The planter is able to, we're able just to get those seeds nestled in a tilthy top couple inches, get better seedling performance, more uniform productivity. And then again, over time, y'all, soil organic matter increases, okay? What does this have to do with Russell 2? If you want to head down this road, Russell 2 can help you gauge if you're doing enough, right? Russell 2 is the only tool we have that can reasonably take a shot at letting us know, hey, are we doing okay on the erosion front? What's our organic matter trend? So it's all tied together. And that takes us to the end of this lesson. Before we leave, this is a question for you to answer about Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization, the book I just mentioned and you heard Dr. Montgomery talk about. It also mentions 7,000 years of conquest of the soil. And to give you another hint, I didn't mention to you that in that book, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, if you're an NRCS employee, it's pretty cool because Montgomery actually in that book actually calls out NRCS as an agency that has done and still doing really great things. All right, we're at 50% participation, so let's go through this together. Look, the following is true of Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. Yes, it basically repeats and expands on key ideas previously expressed in documents like Conquest of the Soils for 7,000 years. So I'm not saying that he plagiarized, he didn't at all, but these are not new ideas, and they are the ideas on which our agencies are founded. If it weren't for those ideas, this NRCS would not probably exist today, and nor would soil water districts. That all grew out of concern about this idea of civilizations falling apart because of unwise soil management. And that is what B says, right? It's true. The book argues that unwise soil management, especially unchecked erosion, key cause of decline for many ancient civilizations. And yes, it's still an existential threat, right? That's the idea. 75 years ago, our soil conservation agencies were created, but according to this scientist, you know, we still are not on the right path as a civilization and also as a country. It is very positive and complimentary about NRCS. And, you know, it does support, you just heard the idea, it supports the idea that you can explain some big things about American history by talking about soil degradation and efforts to get to new land. So the answer is all of the above. And that, my friends, is the end of this lesson. So we got the majority of y'all answered the question correctly. Pretty tough test question, but I think important information. So up next, lesson 4,